This
This
conference will now
conference
be
will now be
recorded.
recorded.
I'd be happy to. Yes. Okay. Commissioner Warren. Here. Commissioner Johnson. Here. Commissioner Fox. Here. Commissioner Hartman. Here. Commissioner Miles. Oh, there she is. And Commissioner McKay. Here. Okay, I see her.
Okay, so Commissioner Miles, can you hear us? Commissioner Miles, we can see your icon and we can see that your microphone is not muted, but we can't hear you. We don't hear you.
You can't hear me? Can't hear me?
Now we do.
And now.
Okay.
Okay. Well, the next item on the agenda is the approval of the previous meeting summaries. I show that everyone except Commissioner Hartman was here.
Second.
Okay. Have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, the same sign. Motion carries. Okay, the first item we have on the agenda today to discuss is the short-term rental update. And Scott, you're going to provide us some information on that.
All right. Thank you, Ty Ben, for bringing that up. All right, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to present this information. This is built off of the information that was presented to the City Council at their workshop in October, so just a couple of weeks ago. Next slide, please. And what the purpose of this is to give you an update on it, give you an opportunity to provide some feedback, and talk with you all about the next steps. Next slide. So we're going to cover a bunch of material in this presentation. I'm not going to read all this out to you, but just want to give you a roadmap about what we'll cover today. Next slide. So process to date. Next slide. The conversation about short-term rentals was really emphasized, especially in Crown Heights, with the death that took place out there. Following that, there was a community meeting, which really we were answering questions about what are our current regulations, what's currently allowed, what's not. Into the summer and fall of 2021, as you can see, we did research and review of what other communities are doing. In 2022, so earlier this year, we had another meeting with Crown Heights, got some really good feedback or valuable feedback out of that, and I'll report back what some of those, some of the sentiments out of that were. And then conducted more research and ultimately did a presentation just, again, a couple of weeks ago to City Council. Next slide. So the first thing is definition and mission, kind of the overview on this one. Next slide. So short-term rentals, it's practice of renting out a, could be an entire home, could be a property, could be just a dwelling unit that's on the property, or could be just a bedroom for a short-term stay, which we would generally identify as something that is less than 7 days in duration. And Airbnb, VRBO, I assume a number of folks have, actually in this room, who all has used a short-term rental? So, okay, so folks from personal experience are familiar with them. Okay, next slide. And one comment about short-term rentals is that it's things can change relatively quickly, right? Because it's all kind of focused online. You can change whether or not a property is up listed as an active short-term rental, whether it's not. You can do the bookings on your mobile phone, so things are very fluid. The next thing here is the city's mission statement. And the city's mission statement is to be an exceptionally well-run city that talks about safety, growing the economy, dependable infrastructure, and conditions for living well. And I think short-term rentals are such an interesting conversation in Wichita because they touch on at least 3 of these, if not 4. Next slide. So a little bit about short-term rentals and numbers about here in our community. Next slide. So we've gotten just since this presentation to the City Council, we've gotten some different numbers, but I'm going to use the consistent ones. And it depends which company you talk to. There are a number of companies that track this information, and they've shared some insights with us. The company Granicus has reported that we currently have approximately 475 short-term rentals in the city of Wichita operating today. And that's on multiple platforms. There's easily more than a dozen different websites or systems that are doing this. And that number is up from 219 in 2018. So you can see from 2018 to 2021, it grew very quickly. You can see from 2021 to 2022, it's been a little bit more moderate in terms of growth. Next slide. They have reported that the average nightly rate here in Wichita is $90 per night. And a quick note that this does not include the cleaning fee. So it's possible that it would be more if you were to check out on an app today, but that the fee, the average nightly rate is $90. Next slide. This is a map that comes from a different company that tracks these. And a question came up. I thought this was interesting because a question came up about where they're primarily located, and that came up at the City Council workshop. You can see here that there's generally some clustering that looks like predominantly focused around downtown, Crown Heights area, and then you can see some pockets kind of further out to the east and west. Next slide. Oh, okay, we've already talked about that one. Next slide. So roughly 90% of short-term rentals are single-family homes. And this question comes up because of whether they're owner-occupied, and that plays into how they would be regulated. In the discussions, as you'll see in our notes coming up in a little bit, that came from Crown Heights, that there was a lot of differentiation between owner-occupied. Folks felt like those probably were not going to get out of hand and cause a neighborhood nuisance, as opposed to ones where the owner is not present while the unit's being rented. Next slide. So that's background about what a short-term rental is, what the current numbers are for the city of Wichita. Now we're going to go into the existing regulations. So next slide. So there are 3 options of how an individual can be or an organization can be running a short-term rental legally in the city of Wichita today with today's regulations. So let's do the first one. Next slide. So option A would be to have on-site management, and this would meet the definition under the zoning code of a bed and breakfast inn. Next slide. And a bed and breakfast inn, I know you can't read this table too well, but in most residential zoning districts, it requires a conditional use. So folks would have to submit an application, they'd have to do the public notices, they would have to come before the MAPC and the District Advisory Board. There would be opportunities for public input on that case. Next slide. So you're all familiar with conditional use process, but just in general, it's about a 4-step process and an opportunity for protest petitions as well. Next slide. So option B would be to operate one of these with stays shorter than 7 days and without having management present, and that would be meet the definition of hotel or motel, which, next slide, which is not allowed, not permitted in residential zoning districts. So if you were operating one of those, you would have to have commercial zoning or whatever you can see here where it's permitted. Next slide. And then option C is to have a property that you are renting for at least 7 days. And if it's got a family or no more than 5 unrelated people, it simply meets the definition of a single family dwelling unit. And it's the same as if you were renting it out to someone for 6 months, for a year, falls under the same provisions. Now, keep in mind, these are the 3 options. And the reason why they're the way that they are is because short-term rentals have come along and the zoning code did not anticipate them. So this is where they fit in our existing zoning code. Next slide. And I'll stand for questions if anyone has any. But yeah, and
You mentioned that 90% of the short-term rental are single-family units, but that people live there. So
well, not necessarily. That's not what I was trying to get across. 90% of them are single-family homes, and most likely in that instance, while they're being rented, my assumption would be that the owner is not present because it is a single-family home. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Scott,
Mr. Dool.
back to the beginning where you went down a list of the process and mentioned Crown Heights. You mentioned it a couple of times.
Yeah.
If I recall, there was an incident in Crown Heights where there was a shooting or something in one of these. Somebody had rented the thing out for a party, and it brings up the question of enforcement, which you're talking about now. But how do you regulate that?
Yes, sir. Yeah, that's a great segue into the next section. So I'll go ahead and cover that. So next slide, please. So the enforcement process here, there's actually 2. We're talking about the one for a zoning issue. So when we receive a complaint, then that a case ends up getting assigned to one of the members of our zoning enforcement division in the planning department. Then the case gets investigated. So folks will go out into the field. They'll see if there's license plates from different states. They will check to see if the house is listed online on Airbnb or VRBO. They will check to see if the number of days that it's listed for. So if you can, whether or not you can stay there for 7 days or more, or whether it's less than 7 days, to see if that's a violation. If there is a violation that's been found, then we will submit a notice to the property owner, and then either it gets resolved and the case gets closed, or we take them to court. So it's a relatively simple one. Now, this is for a zoning violation. Now, if there's something going on like a disturbance that's occurring at the property, or frankly, or something just even flat out illegal, that's another matter. That's something where the police can be called and come out and address the situation. Yes, sir. Mr. Warren?
Scott, have we actually gone through that process?
To my knowledge, we have not gotten to the point where we've taken any property owners to court over a short-term rental operating illegally.
who does the investigation?
I think the question was, who does the investigation? That would be the staff in the planning department in the zoning enforcement division. It will depend. Generally, I would say it would be conducted during the day, but if circumstances warrant, they'll go out and do it at night. Yep. Next slide, please.
But this is only if they're not purpose, right?
That is correct. That Commissioner Miles' question was that process only applies to zoning enforcement, or if they're not zoned correctly, and that is correct. That is about the zoning enforcement portion.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I'm staying the law.
Well, I'm not giving away legal advice. Just trying to explain what the regs are. In terms of enforcement cases, this number, I needed to update this. We are now in 2022. I think we're looking at somewhere between 20 and 30 cases, is what I had heard most recently. Next slide. So that's a little bit about enforcement. Any questions on that? Okay. Other communities. Next slide. So Mary and staff over in Advanced Plans Division have contacted a number of different communities. We've reached out to them to find out whether they do any of these things, so registration, licensing, et cetera, for short-term rentals. Next slide. And what our research has shown is that there tends to be, there's a variety of different ways of doing this. And the best practices, I think, are still being worked out. I think communities are tailoring the regulations and the processes that they put in place to their local conditions. And you can see that it's quite varied in terms of the number of things that they put in place. Now we're continuing to do research into this. We have a draft document that we've got put together, and we're hoping to publish that. And we'll send that out to y'all when we get that posted online. Next slide. Public input. This is where I'll talk about some of the input that we've received from Crown Heights. Next slide. And there's been a variety of ways that we've gotten input, but the one I want to highlight is Crown Heights Neighborhood Association, the most recent one in February. And there was a fair amount of support, as you can see here, for short-term rentals that were operating, that were owner-occupied. Again, I think a lot of the comments were that they would expect that the owner would help address any situations where there was noise or issues that were affecting neighboring properties. When it came to short-term rentals that where a property owner was not present, then there seemed to be a broad range of opinion. We had folks during the meeting that said, don't even allow them at all. We had folks at the meeting saying, you know, hey, we operate them, we do a good job, we think that they should be allowed, and everything in between. There was a lot of emphasis on neighborhood and neighbor input into the process, and that's something that we've tried to consider, as you'll see in a little bit. Next slide, please. Overall, there was support during that meeting for licensing, a way to keep track, and also a way to ensure that people are operating good faith and obeying regulations. The fees, again, there was a lot of feedback on that and pretty wide range of answers on that one. And then there were also, the next one you can see there is fears about the impacts that short-term rentals would have on quality of life. Some of the things that came up were, you know, traffic, noise, disturbances, trash, also property values, from property values increasing in the area where these are located is one of the fears that was expressed. And then another one too was a lack of neighbors or residents that you could establish long-term relationships with. So missing out on having neighbor kids or neighboring families. So, but I think at the same time, and it's not a bullet point in here, there were people who operated short-term rentals and also people who had stayed in short-term rentals who talked about the convenience of being able to use them, and also that they, you know, that they did a good job of operating them and they were careful about how they operated them. So again, quite a wide variety of opinions that were shared. And there were lots of questions about enforcement and what regulations are in place and how that all works. So, next slide. So on to possible regulations. And what we do is we're putting this out there for consideration and comment. I'm very interested to get your feedback and whether you think this is headed in the right direction, whether there's tweaks that are needed. So any and all comments would be very, very helpful. We also have information about this posted online so that folks can weigh in and send emails, etc. And just know that this is still very much an early draft. So we're trying to find out if this is a solution that is a good fit for Wichita, or whether, you know, we need to tailor it some more. Next slide. Yes, sir.
Going to these three options you gave up here in the middle one, on the licensing, how would that be policed, I guess?
Okay. Well, there are three possible changes. So changes to the zoning code, creation of a licensing program, and then a municipal code. So the way that the licensing would be policed, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, but if you're in violation of any elements of the license, then your license could be suspended, revoked, you could lose the ability to operate a short-term rental at that location.
my question is the policing of getting everybody that's eligible licensed.
Oh, yes, that comes down to enforcement and enforcement technologies. And I can talk more about it. We don't have slides specifically on it, but it's an excellent question. And when we reached out to communities, the ones that are doing it manually with individuals, the way that we're doing it now, conducting the research and going online and seeing if they can find the unit or the home and trying to see if it's the correct number of days, all that stuff. It's very time intensive, and they simply were not able to keep up with the volume of these because you're talking about over 400 units. So we have been contacted by a number of companies that do this in a digital fashion with an online system. One of them uses artificial intelligence to match up photos in Google Street View or appraisers data with photos that are shown on the listing, and keeps track of how often the unit is listed, available, where it's at, who the owner is. It ties in multiple data points to create kind of an overview of the property. So it's looks like it's pretty sophisticated stuff, but those systems will alert staff to if there's a potential for a violation or a probable violation at a property, and then allows the human element for folks to go out and investigate.
So you have, let's say you have a list of license of 200 people,
Mm-hmm.
and you go back through the process you just got to speaking about, and there's 225 people that are on the want list, I guess you might say, or listing list. So that's one way of policing it, you're saying?
Yeah, they will match up the database of who's licensed and the database of which ones are operating in your community, and they will show red dots for each of the ones that's out of compliance. Because otherwise, in my opinion, if you're leaving it to doing it manually, you'll have a very tough time getting ahead of this, and it's going to be pretty expensive. Next slide. So there's three changes that are at least being brought forward for consideration. The first one is zoning code changes, and this would apply only to the city of Wichita. It's important to note because we have a joint code, so just for the city of Wichita. And it would allow short-term rentals in the city, and they would be permitted by right or conditional use depending on what the zoning district is that they're located in and whether or not they're owner occupied. Next slide. So there are 4 zoning districts that we noted from public input received that people are especially curious about or interested in finding out, how these will be regulated. So from SF10, which we don't hear very much about, there's not a lot of it in our community. SF5, which there's a lot. TF3, there's quite a bit, and then MF18 and MF29. So for all 4 of those zoning districts, those are the ones for which the next table will apply. Next slide. So if it's owner occupied and it is in one of those zoning districts, and I think that I need to correct my slides because I've got 5 zoning districts on this one. If it's in one of those zoning districts and it's owner occupied, then it would be allowed by right. Now, if it's not owner occupied and it's located in one of those zoning districts, then it would require a conditional use. Now, if you move out of those districts and it's owner occupied, or if it's not owner occupied, as long as it's not in one of those zoning districts, it would be allowed by right. For the districts where it makes sense. I mean, there may be like industrial zoning or Air Force Base or something where it doesn't, but for the ones where it makes sense, it would be allowed by right. Owner occupied. It is identified both in the zoning code and in the licensing, and I think it has to do, I forget the specifics, but it's based on the number of days that the owner is on premise. Oh, yes, it's required that they would be there. In order to qualify as owner occupied and you're operating a short-term rental, the owner has to be at the site. Now, that doesn't mean they can't go to the grocery store and they can't go and run errands or do their daily routine. You could, there are listings for, sometimes people list just a bedroom or 2 bedrooms in a single family home.
Or an accessory dwelling unit or a,
That would probably,
second story, second floor basement apartment.
that's right. That's more likely what you will encounter, is that there's an apartment unit or a second accessory dwelling unit on the site. These are really good questions. These get into the nuances.
Within the city, there are still some places that have homeowner associations. And if a homeowner association does not allow rental, but someone has a license to operate, whose rule will,
The private covenants would take precedent in that situation. The
and then
city,
it's their responsibility to police that also? Is that accurate?
that's correct. And I know that there's public questions. I think I'll look to Mr. Dool probably after we're done with the commission, with the presentation of commissions. I think we'll come out for public. Okay, yes, sir.
I'm just trying to understand what TF3
Oh.
stands for.
Oh, you bet. The question is, what does TF3 stand for? And that stands for 2 family, and then the 3 stands for 3,000 square feet, which is the square footage for the dwelling unit.
Scott, and by the way, there's a lot of homeowners associations that are doing exactly what Ann just asked was happening.
Yep. That's what we've heard about, is either newer ones that are coming online will outright prohibit it, or they'll go back and revisit their provisions to see about
Even
excluding.
some that's 30 or 40 years old are going back to it.
Mhm.
Well, and we've approved several developments with ADUs by right.
Mhm.
So those homeowner associations also are saying, but we don't have any built out yet.
Well, it depends, because again, it's related to accessory dwelling units, because you can use it for a short-term rental, but you can have an accessory dwelling unit without it being a short-term rental, right? So they could, not quite the same thing, but closely related.
So you're saying, Scott, that the restrictive covenants of the subdivision and the homeowners association takes precedence over anything we're talking about here?
Yes. As far as short-term rentals are related, yes. Yeah.
Okay. On page 17 of your presentation, it said city of Wichita only. I'm assuming that is, we don't want to confuse the issue at this point, that we'd work out something for the city of Wichita and then go back later and determine if it applies for the county, or if the rules for the county would be.
And we have asked the county staff if they would like for changes to the county portion of the zoning code related to this. And at this time, it doesn't sound like it's a priority. So I think in some regards, it gives them the opportunity to see what takes place in Wichita, see how well it works, and see if there needs to be any adjustments in the county. But at this point, it does not sound like it's a priority for adjusting.
Okay. And my other question was, I know that you've been looking at other cities for their rules and regulations, what they come up with. It looks to me like that most of these short-term rentals are similar to bed and breakfast. And so you basically, you got a legal process to go through. It seemed to me that maybe if simplify that process to bring more properties in, go back and look at what we're doing for bed and breakfast, because this is a type of bed and breakfast.
It is. And actually in a couple of slides, I'll talk about that. But one thing to keep in the back of your mind is the process. So if a conditional use is required, you've got 400 of these things, maybe 700, depending on who's counting. Then how do you process that many applications?
That's what I was saying. They need to simplify the
Yeah.
process, so we don't have to go through the full-blown process we do now for bed and breakfast, but come up with something
Yeah.
that's much simpler with hard and fast rules that can be easily figured out.
And I appreciate that feedback.
Scott,
Yes, sir.
so going back to your previous point in this presentation, If the owners are present during these rentals, basically you classify it as bed and breakfast, right?
It's interesting because under our current zoning code, if the owners are present, it does fit the definition of a bed and breakfast. However, a bed and breakfast requires a conditional use to operate in most residential zoning districts. So what we're talking about right now on this screen is what's possible changes for consideration and discussion.
Sure.
What we talked about prior was what's in place today. Yeah.
I may have missed in the statistics you presented, but what percentage of the rentals that you're tracking have owners present, and what percentage are not present?
Based on the conversations that we've had with companies that track this, I would estimate probably 90%, high 80s are where the owner is not present.
That's what I would have thought. Thank you.
Sure. These are really good questions, really good conversation. Next slide. So the zoning code changes that are before you would add a new definition, so a new land use term definition in our zoning code, and it would roll in bed and breakfast. So they would be under the same definition. However, short-term rental would not include group residence. So when we think about fraternity, sorority, those kind of living arrangements, that is not would not be combined with short-term rental. Hotel motel definition would not include short-term rental. It would be a standalone. So next slide. The other thing too is, I know for fans of Airstreams, this is tough, but short-term rentals would not allow you to use a recreational vehicle, an RV, as a short-term rental. The other thing too is that it would have to be licensed with the city, and it would have to be in compliance with all the various codes. Next slide. So that is the zoning portion. The zoning portion is actually fairly small in terms of changes in text. The licensing is more robust. The license, and I apologize, I just realized we didn't get you printed copies of these, but what we can do is make sure to email them out so you'll have time to look over them this week. Annual license required, so a license would be required every year. You would have to have insurance, and the insurance would be on the unit in case anything should happen, should the owner be found liable for negligence or something on that order. There'd be a good policy that'd be posted in each unit, kind of explaining what the expectations would be of folks who are using it, also of the owners, and that there would be a maximum occupancy if the unit is not owner occupied. If it's owner occupied, then given a recent court case, there would not be an occupancy limit on the unit. And there's a recent court case that the outcome of that is that local governments, the interpretation I've heard is that local government should not be setting an occupancy limit on owner occupied units. And so we've carried that forward in this instance with the short-term rentals. And
isn't there a safety issue with occupancy rates that even residential structures have occupancy?
We can invite Jeff to come and talk about the nuances. What I can speak to is just how it impacts what we're proposing for short-term rentals, because you're right, it does get into some good nuances there. But in terms of short-term rentals, because of that court case, we're recommending that there would be a difference between owner occupied and non-owner occupied. And that in the case of non-owner occupied, there would be a limit of 2 adults per bedroom plus an additional 2 adults for the unit. And that assumes that someone could be sleeping in like the living room or a fold out couch or something like that. And then a gathering with a maximum of 20 persons or less, depending on the number of bedrooms and all that kind of stuff, would be limited until 10 p.m. After that, it would be allowed until 10 p.m. and then they would have to be reduced down to what the occupancy of the unit is. The intention is that we wanted to provide a provision where people could have larger gatherings, like a family reunion or, you know, whatever, a get together. But at 10 o'clock, it would have to go down to the number of people who are permitted to stay at the location. And then an operator would have to be available 24/7 as a requirement of the license. Next slide. The other thing too is that the city would have the right to inspect short-term rental units. So this would be codes, compliance inspection, fire inspection, and the like. So you can see here that the unit would obviously have to be in compliance with our codes. And then there's a provision here that we definitely would like some feedback on. One thing that we heard about during the public input that we received was questions about what happens if these things cluster together. If you start to see blocks where there's multiple short-term rentals on the block and there's kind of a clustering within a neighborhood. And so one of the provisions of the license would be that they would have to be 600 feet. There would be a separation distance of 600 feet from one unit to the next. And I've got a map that will show you what that looks like. Now, with the licensing, what we would expect is that the units that are in operation would not have, they would be grandfathered in under this provision. So if you've been operating one, you would not have to comply with a 600-foot separation, but a new unit coming in, a new STR to get licensed would have to fit that. Yes, sir.
How did you come up with the 600 feet?
Great question. Let's go to the next slide and I'll show you. And let's go to the next slide and we can come back to this one later on. So the 600-foot distance, the reason why we arrived at that, or at least why we're starting the conversation with that, is because 600 feet is the typical length of a standard city block. So you get that distance from north to south in this case. Now what that does though is that it's a perimeter that's obviously a circle around the unit. So you end up with about one block in distance north to south, the long way of the blocks, but the short way you end up with about 200 feet. I mean, sorry, 2 blocks, the short distance. And you can see on this graph, and I'll step away here. Well, maybe I'll just point with this. You can see the orange. The orange is the 600-foot perimeter. So you can see if this is in the middle of the block, it's to the middle of the block to the north, and it's to the middle of the block to the south. But you can see it's 1, 2 into the second block to the east and to the west. Yes, sir.
I'd be really careful about this. I'm coming up with all kinds of problems. I can see an owner of a property in, say, the Moorings, backs up to the lake and gets transferred, but he wants to keep the home because he's going to only be gone for 2 or 3 years and wants to do short-term rentals because of the presence of the lake. You put one in, and the next door neighbor is in the same service. He gets transferred. He wants to do the same thing. Now he can't.
Yeah, good point. And that's, we're really looking for feedback about, is the separation requirement a good thing to include? If it is a good thing, what should the distance be?
City of Topeka did a study on the impact of a vacant property on the values and the safety of adjacent properties. And that study made it very clear that a property that's got nobody in it, no eyeballs on the neighborhood, does contribute to devaluing the adjacent properties. So I think like limiting it is, to me, would be very important, or suddenly you have a concentration in an area and there's nobody home. Sometimes that becomes unsafe for people around it.
Well, using that example, how do you cure that problem? It's either vacant and it's a problem that way, or they're occupied part of the time.
Well, right, occupied part of the time is better than not.
600-foot regulation.
I think this is a tough issue because, like I said at the beginning, there's 3 probably elements of the City of Wichita mission: quality of life, economic vibrancy, that are all touched, and I forget what the third one is, but they're all touched by short-term rentals. And so it's a matter of where do we want to end up on that spectrum or on that axis as a community.
Scott, would it be an idea, and I'm just thinking out loud, to do a percentage of number of units in the area?
That would be another option possibly. Yeah. So you could say within a certain distance, there would only be that a certain percentage of dwelling units would be, or properties would be limited to having as short-term rentals.
A lot of these areas, like what you got circled here, some of the lots are only 25 feet.
Yeah.
If you go by the footage, and there's a lot of vacant lots, people have torn down houses and stuff to that effect.
Yeah. If we go to the prior slide, Ty Ben, if you can go back one slide. So we did this exercise in a couple of different locations because, and this was an example from, these are both from Crown Heights. So we wanted to see how this would look in the neighborhood. And you can see that, yeah, when you start to, you're just basically flipping north to south for east to west, kind of the orientation of the blocks. And you can see that this one would, 600 feet would extend beyond Central and capture a lot of units. So yeah, just something to explore. Any and all feedback. This has been a really good discussion, but any other thoughts you've got would be great. Yeah.
Well, if they're regulated correctly, why do we need to restrict them?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
And again, the reason why this was even included in the draft is because of the comments that we heard about multiple short-term rentals locating into a neighborhood. And so we're looking to see if this is a good fit for Wichita or not. Yeah. But lots of philosophical discussion. And
the license would be a license per unit for this use, or if I'm an LLC and I've got 15 properties, I could have one license. I have the correct insurance on all those properties. That's one license per operator, or one license per unit.
My recollection is that it's one license per unit. So
Okay, Scott, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to make sure I'm clarifying everything. So I own the slumber party place. I had it rezoned so I can use it as hotel motel.
Yep.
I have more than 2 people per bedroom because I've got a huge playroom that the kids sleep in. I may have a dozen kids there and a couple of adults. Do I have to have a license? And am I then violating these new requirements?
No, in that case, you're operating as a hotel motel, so you would not be meeting the definition of a short-term rental because you're already allowed under hotel motel.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, let's keep moving then. Next slide. And next. So in terms of enforcement for licensing, so again, planning department would primarily be in charge of enforcement of this license. There'd be a fine that could apply, suspension of license, and your license could be revoked if certain conditions are met. Next slide. Okay, so there's, we've talked about the changes to the zoning code, we've talked about the license, and then this one's changes to the municipal code. And this change was intended to address the issue of owner-occupied, if there's owner-occupied units, or frankly, any of them that are causing nuisances on adjoining properties or neighbors. So what it does is it's modeled after a number of cities that have this something similar in place, and it's about nuisance gatherings. And it's much of what you would expect, that it identifies defines what a nuisance activity is, what the enforcement would be, and what the penalties are. So, it's a raucous party kind of spills out of a unit onto the yard or whatever, or music's too loud. And not only is it a noise violation, but they can, under this, there could be penalties under the party house ordinance. Next slide. Okay, so those are the three elements. I think we've had a really good discussion today. The next slide is going to talk about next steps. So we've updated our website following the project website. If you go to wichita.gov/STR, you'll see the information in the drafts that are currently posted. We're always looking for feedback, and we'll see about changes to drafts. We're reviewing enforcement systems, so we're talking to at least a couple of companies, a number of companies, to learn more about how those work and how they might be, if and whether they'd be a fit for Wichita. And then we'll take it through the review and approval process, much like any other zoning code change or municipal code change. So next slide, and I think that that's the last one. Yep, so again, if you want to go to wichita.gov/STR, you can find out more information. If you got any comments or any questions, you can always contact Mary. We can get those addressed.
Scott, is this going to have to be, if it's handled by the planning department, it's a whole new division within the planning department?
Well, it would fall under zoning enforcement, and since the planning department is so prominently featured in enforcement, that's why I'm pleased to say that as part of the 2023 budget, the city council approved an allocation of funding for an enforcement system. Now, obviously, we don't want to move forward with that until the timing is right, and we're still in conversations to learn more about them so we can develop a good RFP. But if we get permission to move forward with that, I think having a system to augment our existing staffing is going to be critical in order to be successful.
The reason why I asked that is because in the past we've had meetings in here about how you're shorthanded and
yeah,
begin with.
Yeah,
now we're adding one more layer on.
It is, and that's where I think the technological systems are going to be really important. And we'll talk more about staffing even later on today as part of this meeting. And we're seeing a lot of that staffing crunch when it comes to current plans activities. And we have pulled JR to help out with that. And that has deprived zoning enforcement of some of the staff hours that they would normally have. One of the things that we did was we applied for funding for another zoning enforcement staff position. That was not approved as part of the process. That's an ongoing conversation. The other thing too is that as part of the licensing, that's part of the challenge with the licensing, is that there would be a fee associated with it. And so the fee we know is going to have to cover inspections. It's going to have to cover the administrative costs. It's going to have to cover the enforcement system software. But then the other question is what additional staff hours are going to be required for this entire, not just that system, but the overall short-term rental system to make it work.
Just one more clarification. So we know that most of these short-term rentals, the owners are not present, but among those where the owner is not present, there's still a big difference between whether the owner occupies that place or not, or if it's not occupied at all. Is your proposals going to identify that there's a difference in the way you treat these between somebody that's never there versus somebody that's there half the time, or how do you define that?
Mm-hmm. Well, in order to, if we found someone who is operating as an owner occupied, but it does not meet the definition of owner occupied, that they're in violation,
right?
That would be an enforcement issue. And so we will work on that. We will tackle that with them.
So what's the chance you could expand this to long-term rentals in areas without homeowner associations to protect their neighborhoods?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm not really in a good position to talk about that one today, but open question, sure.
Scott, of these people that you had okay, and let's use the problem that created the area that created the problem or started it, brought it to light. What percentage of those people are owner occupied, not just occupied, but owner occupied?
You mean for the properties in the neighborhood overall, or
yes.
Do you mean for the short-term rentals? Owner occupied in that neighborhood, I would guess is fairly high, but I don't have any, I don't have any data that I've collected on it. It would be relatively simple to do. It takes some time, but we could do that if you're interested.
I don't know, all I'm trying to say is owner occupied, you put owner in front, makes a difference than just occupied property.
Yeah.
I could live in a property and not own it and be a very, very good person to live there, and I've lived there for 20 years, but I don't own it.
Yeah.
Owner occupied has a connotation, in my opinion, is you got to own that property and have fee simple title to it, period.
Well, and that's, and you know, shoot, I'm kicking myself because I wish I had the documents, but when we distribute those to you, you'll see the definition of owner occupied in them. And I think that will address some of the questions.
Hey, Scott. It's Lonnie Barnes. It's a quick question back to that 600 foot distance in here and limiting the number that you can have in here. You know, Scott, I also get concerned in here. We don't put a limit on the number of rental properties that we can have in a neighborhood. And so I think that's a little tough with that 600 in here, because we got some neighborhoods in here that are probably 70–80% rental property here. And few homeowners, we never put a restriction on how many rentals we can have, even in a circumference or a neighborhood association or those kind of things.
Well, Lonnie, thanks for the opportunity to address that. And I just want to clearly state that this is only on short-term rentals. This is not on other types of rentals. It's focused strictly on the ones that meet the definition of a short-term rental that we talked about in the beginning of this, which is something that's being rented typically for less than 7 days and is done on a platform like Airbnb or VRBO. And I'm going to turn over the microphone for a question.
I think sometimes.
Wes Galion for the record. I just had a quick question. I don't think it applies here, but I just want to make sure. There are a number of nonprofits in the community that provide short-term rental opportunities for clients. Typically, they're more than 7 days. But they are a transient type person. Just wondered if you needed to clarify that they won't be affected by this sort of thing based on their mission.
No, good question. And my assumption on those is that they're operating legally per the zoning code, and so this would not affect them. Yeah.
Are there any more questions? Well, Scott, thank you for a very thorough discussion of this, and we'll look forward to see how it unfolds.
Thank you all.
Excuse me, go ahead.
It's a simple answer, probably.
Sure.
My name is Lee McLeod. I live at 2708 West Benjamin Drive. I'm the president of the Neighborhood Association, Benjamin Hills and Pleasant Valley. I'm curious about, does your entity here, the zoning process, have the ability to track or enforce rules for landlords of rentals? Because there seems to be a huge issue of them being able to evict people without any consequences, and maybe it falls in a completely different area, but I'm curious.
Sure. I think that lines up with a couple of questions, and I'm hearing that as kind of community feedback that I probably can adjust the presentation a little bit to address this head on. Well, but this does not impact what maybe we would think of as more regular rentals, which is something where someone's renting out a house or a property for 12 months or 6 months, or so this doesn't impact that. In terms of who does the enforcement on those, I think for building issues, I think that would really be MABCD. And I'm assuming here that we're talking about single family homes that are up for rent, not necessarily commercial properties. And so I would direct you to MABCD to talk about any kind of compliance with building codes or anything on that order. If it's something about people who are being evicted, that almost sounds like more of a legal issue that may be between the two parties, or something possibly that housing and community services would have some information on.
Scott, I think there's state statutes you have to follow to do that.
Okay, so state statutes would govern, sounds like a lot of that.
Scott, I do have a question. In the process going through this and you looking at other cities, have you found a city or an entity that you've looked at and said, man, they really got their handle on it?
You know, it's been interesting. Mary's done a lot of that research, so I'll turn it over for her to address. But I would like to point out that the solutions have been very different. There's one community that, for instance, they look to the adjacent property owners to indicate whether or not they're in approval of the short-term rental operating, and that influences what the process is for that application to be considered, and whether it's fast-tracked or whether it has to go through more public input. There are some communities that handle this all through licensing. There are other communities that don't even address it at all yet. Mary, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, it is quite varied. Talking about those public meetings, one of the requirements some cities have is they have to sponsor a meeting with all of their neighbors, and they determine how many. And they want signatures from, say, 55% of those property owners giving their blessing to this license. I mean, that's rather involved. Some only go as far as if your property touches their property across the street to the north, the south, east, you know, and then they want their signatures. But others, like Lubbock, Texas, it's anything goes so long as you're paying your taxes. And what happens is as some of these communities experience having these in their community, that's when they start adjusting their regulations. Because, you know, they ask the question, well, what could possibly go wrong? Well, open up for business and you'll find out. And so I think places that have lots of tourism, meaning lots of people coming in for a certain event several times a year, or let's say it's a skiing community up in Colorado, you know, where it's all tourists. And even people that own their homes just leave and rent out their homes. So it's just really quite mind-boggling how big. But the longer they're in business, the more refined their regulations become.
Again, thank you for the detailed discussion on this. If there's nothing else on this topic, we'll move on to the next one, which is Stephen Banks talking about development trends.
Good afternoon, commissioners. Wait for the PowerPoint here. This is for the 2022 development trends. Next slide. Residential activity has been pretty good for subdivisions, up 9% for Wichita and 10% over the 5-year average. The regional total is up 50% from 2020 and 63% over the 5-year average. Next slide. Commercial wasn't quite as strong. Commercial and office subdivision activity decreased by 55%, but industrial subdivision activity increased by 62%. Next slide. Vacant buildable lots. I think everyone here is familiar with those where water, sewer, and streets have been put in order to obtain a building permit. And we're not including the, next slide, we're not including the established central area except in areas, if you go to the next map, where there has been new subdivision activity, and you do see a spot in there with 38 where some property was developed or is being redeveloped. There had been a school, hospital facility that was demolished, and now that's been subdividing, so we are tracking that. Next slide. In terms of buildable vacant lots, we have comparatively low interest rates and a tight market. Wichita continues to be a strong market, and some development areas have a higher inventory, But given the circumstances we've seen with the building industry, I think we're doing really good. No need to worry about the inventory at this time with an overall 2.64 year supply. We look at 3 years as being sort of the benchmark where we might become a little bit worried, but I think we're doing really well. Next slide. For building activity, residential building continues to be strong with an 8% increase in dwelling units for Wichita from 2020. And small cities saw a 17% increase in dwelling units. Next slide. For commercial activity, generally good. Wichita permits were 3% above 2020, but the square footage was down 48%. So a little bit more in terms of number of permits, but the size of the projects decreased. Conversely, small cities were 8% below in permits, but 278% above 2020. And that's because of the Amazon project and the box manufacturing facility up in Park City, as well as a large cotton warehouse that was built down in Clearwater, also up near 1 million square feet in size. So that's why those numbers really jumped in the small cities. That's just a quick summary. You've got the report in front of you. You can study that, and if the MAPC later wants a fuller discussion on this, we can arrange for that. But unless you have any other questions.
We have any questions for the develop on this topic? If not, go ahead.
I don't want to be pessimistic, but the gentleman sitting over here on the right can probably tell you this is great, and you're probably 100% right. In the past, we've hit a milestone here in the last 6 to 8 months with interest rates, cost of doing business. I don't think the next year, because we're down considerably in starts and everything. So
yeah, we may see some changes next year. As of this report, I think we were good up until this point, but now interest rates are starting to affect things. The question is, we seem to be doing a little bit better here than a lot of other communities where you hear almost doomsday reports. Will people, is there enough pressure to still keep doing some of this and continue using up the inventory? I'm sure developers are going to say, I'm not going to put in the water, streets, and sewer quite yet on some of these phases. And so we can, keep things going in a good fashion so that we're maintaining. And so far, they're saying if we really do go into a recession, this should be short-lived compared to 2008 and 2010.
Stephen, could we maybe clarify? I mean, 2022 isn't even over yet, and we're calling this 2022. So where did it cut off?
Well, these development trends reports always summarize the previous year. So this is 2021 activity.
So that kind of explains why the last 6 months hasn't hit this.
Well, yeah. And actually, I think for Wichita, the problem wouldn't have even hit until around August, September. Wes, you can probably correct me on this, but we had a real estate forum in, what was it, beginning of September? And, despite the demand, we're kind of stuck at this level of 1,500, 1,700 units a year just because of the supply situation and labor situation. The industry is producing what it can at this point. And, but since then, we've had more push on the interest rates. And so we'll just have to see how that goes. Do you have any other clarification on that? Okay.
We have been talking to our developers and builders and remodelers and others about what the market is showing right now. It is starting to slow down. Sales are starting to slow. We anticipated that would happen because we were running at such a robust pace. It's hard to maintain that level, at infinitum. So our data through, like for single family homes as an example, which is information used by WSU in their forecast, through August, we were 11% up for the whole area. We expect it to trend down for the balance of the year. And we don't think that the forecast for that Stan Longhofer did with WSU says that we'll be down slightly for 2023. We may be down more than slightly for 2023 because it depends on several things. I think there are those that thought the aggressive steps being taken by the feds would probably slow down a little bit. Most recently, they announced that's probably not going to be the case. And if you go back to the 70s and 80s and you look at what took place, the notion of there being a recession got factored into got embedded in the thoughts people had about how long it would last. And it perpetuated itself on a down basis for almost 10 years before it came out of it. Hopefully that won't happen. But if the feds push hard enough and that becomes embedded in the psyche of the public and others, then they'll become comfortable or cautious about moving beyond the level it drops to. And it'll be a very gradual trend up going forward. We're still expecting continued good activity in multifamily, and that's happening nationwide. Housing is slowing. The interest rates are having a pretty good effect, a negative effect on entry-level buyers and move-up buyers. Go back a couple of years or a year and a half, year ago, they were saying, well, we expect interest rates to maybe be 4.5 to maybe 5%. They're already over 7%. They move around almost every day. So the higher that rate goes, the more cautious people become about buying because they just don't want to take the risk, or they can't qualify for the loans, which is more likely the case. And the more they opt for rentals, which is what's driving the rental sector right now. So we'll see going forward. But I think going forward, at best, we can count on things being pretty flat, not much upward activity. If everything goes as planned and the feds do start softening their position a little bit on raising rates further to the extent that they have, but if not, it'll worsen.
Question, what is the builder community seeing for the material cost and supply chain issues? Are those continuing and having an impact as well?
They are. What we're seeing is some prices come down on some materials like dimension lumber and things of that nature, but it's still such an unstable market that we anticipate we'll see continued high prices, not going down to where it was before. Part of the reason for that is not just the inability to attract product to use to make products out of. It's the sizing down of companies that were making products before, and many of them have made a determination, I think, and probably rightfully so, to right size their companies. So they're not planning to go big again. They're trying to stay more profitable and smaller and more nimble. And that will slow down the process of reaching some point of equilibrium on the supply side of the equation.
I think, following up with what Wes said, most of the stuff that's going on now was financed before rates started going crazy.
Yeah.
So that's going to have a bearing on what we've done. Also, another situation is the utility. Is it Evergy? Evergy is having a lot of problems with everything at this point in time. But I think that this is a good report, and it's a great report. But I'm saying that from the last half of this year through the first quarter and maybe the second quarter of next year, it's going to be a complete different situation, primarily because of the interest rates. It's so flexible now. Wes mentioned a while ago, 70s and 80s. I'm old enough to was building back in those days. Interest rates were 19 and 20% back in those days.
Yeah.
So what you see today at 7%, it seems like a bargain.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's all a matter of perspective. And as several reports have said, the younger buyers, especially right now, have not seen those interest rates that occurred basically back in the Carter years and the Paul Volcker Fed days, where, yeah, he did propose a 20% rate. Yeah.
I remember those days. People were talking about burying money in their backyard.
Well, the city even got a bond issue to help finance single family housing. Because, and it was, I think, a 7% or 7.5%. And it sold out in like 20 seconds. So that's how bad it got to be. But it was at one time, it was up to 21% interest in the late 70s.
Are there any more questions for Stephen on this? Thank you again for the update on development trends. Moving on to the next agenda item, we have project updates by Scott.
Sure, and I'm going to distribute the handout real quick.
Thanks, sir.
This is very much the standard format that you all are used to for the department updates. And I'll try and describe it for those who are joining online. But on page 2 of the report, we've got non-subdivision items. So this is anything that is not a plat or a what we term a SUB case in our tracking system. And what you'll see is we've got a graph that shows that pretty steady. We were pretty steady through most of this year. It looks like we're going to finish out pretty steady. There was one meeting, the infamous October 6th meeting with 25 items. That's what that very large mountain, Mount Everest, there in the chart is. The underneath that, we've got some bar graph that shows that we're currently sitting at about 208 cases, and this is very close to a 5-year high. The high was in last year at 229 cases, and I think we're going to close out pretty close to that, probably in the teens somewhere, but not quite as high as we were last year. So very much though in the ballpark. I think what that communicates is that we've just continued to be busy, but we're closing out the year with a comfortable pace that we can handle and accommodate over in current plans, which is really great. On page 3, this is for the plats. Subdivision activity has been very busy, and again, we need to work on changing this to show you the number of lots that are being created by a subdivision, because we have a plat come through. It could be for one lot, or it could be for 100 lots. So we'll work on getting this changed for 2023. But in the meantime, even just counting individual, just the plats themselves, not the number of lots they're producing, you can see that this year was very robust, and we're already at a 5-year high, not even having closed out the year. So we'll continue to see some activity. We know it's dropped off a little bit, but we typically see things kind of swing up when it comes to plats towards the end of the year. On the next page, on page 4, we have a table that shows you the commission meeting dates, and then the number of administrative adjustments, the non-subdivision cases, how many were deferred, withdrawn, and then plats as well. And we use this to kind of gauge just in general what the activity is. It's all represented on the charts that you've seen just before, but the unique information of this one is the actual numbers of cases. And I've highlighted the boxes where the number of cases has exceeded our ability for the staff and current plans to process those cases. So again, that's when we call on advanced plans, or we call on retired employees such as Bill Longnecker to come in and help us out with those. And I think in the case of the non-subdivision cases, that accounted for more than 50% of the meetings. We had more cases than current plans could handle. So we're staying very, very busy with that. On page 5 is the table for non-subdivision cases. And on this one, it gives you the case count. But the thing that I keep an eye on is the average number of cases that are on an MAPC meeting agenda. And for non-subdivision items, that was about 9. And that's an average. So we had some that were very, very high, like 25 cases. And then we had some that were pretty low. I think our minimum was 3 cases in one case on one agenda. Which by looking at it, looks like I need to update that to be 5, but we'll get that addressed. On the next page, page 6, shows you our staffing. Administration division, we've got 1 vacant position, and I'm pleased to say that we had posted that position. We've been through the interview process, and we have made an offer to a candidate, and they have accepted. And so we are hiring a gentleman who comes to us from as a former principal of one of the schools in the area. And so he's going to bring some robust administration management experience, as well as the experience of working in a local government system with a governing board and preparing the memos and keeping track of the numbers. So very excited to bring him on board, and that'll bring us to 100% occupancy in the administration division. The other one then to pay attention to then is advanced plans, and there's currently 1 open position there, and we are working on an advanced fill for Stephen's position. Both of those have proven to be challenging. So the good news, though, is that we're moving forward with some interviews here shortly. So for one of the positions, and we are continuing to advertise Stephen's position and have listed it on some additional websites.
Scott, question.
Yes, sir.
On seeking candidates, what's your process on that? Do you use recruiters to try to find people that are qualified?
We've done that if we run into a position where we've flown it for a substantial amount of time and have not been able to get a robust pool of applicants. And in fact, I'm glad you bring it up, because we'll have to talk internally, but maybe that would be a good option for Stephen's position, given the specialized skills that he brings. The question was, when does Stephen retire? And the answer is December 5th. So yes, we're definitely looking at we've got to look at a variety of options to be able to cover. Whenever I see people who used to work, who have retired, and they look about 10 years younger than the last time you saw them. We'll keep. I'm sure we'll keep in touch with Steve. We'll see if maybe he wouldn't be willing to come back and help us out with a report or 2.
We did that with Longnecker, he came back.
I know we did that with Bill Longnecker, and he's pretty surly. He's pretty feisty. We enjoy having him around, though. On to page 7, we've got a listing of the different projects. Short-term rentals, you just saw the presentation there, and that has been to the workshop. So we're looking at getting some feedback on that one. Solar regulations, we've been reaching out to a stakeholder, haven't heard back. And this is a stakeholder who provided comments the last go round on solar before they were adopted. And so we reached out to him a second time. I think our next step then is to go ahead and go to the elected officials, give them a heads up on where we're at, check in with them, and then bring it back to you all and take it out to the broader public. Nightclubs, still need to meet with the nightclub owners. This one has not been pressing at the moment, but we know we need to get that wrapped up. Home occupation daycares, this has come up rather quickly, and you all saw that I think at your last meeting. And so we're doing briefings with some of the elected officials, and we'll be bringing this one scheduled for the MAPC coming up on the 17th. Places for people, the incentives, you saw a presentation on what's going on with the MABCD incentives. Land Bank, they've got their own meetings, so I just mentioned those. And then with the zoning, still got the conversations going on about duplexes, and I think we need to, we'll continue those, but for right now, nothing new on those at the moment. So with that, that wraps up the report. Any questions? Much better than at the beginning of the year. Yeah, we have, and I think about the amount of change that the department's gone through and that the planning commission has gone through in the last 2 years, and it's been very substantial. And we're very fortunate to have a good crew and get to work with really great people. So I appreciate all of you.
Thanks, Scott. Do we have any comments from the public? Anybody here up to 3 minutes to speak? Or is there anybody virtual that has anything they want to comment on at this time? I don't have any other business. Next meeting is scheduled for December 1st at 10:30. With that, I believe we're adjourned. Thank you.